to intimacy. And same thing, we start from here, from this little definition is close familiarity or friendship. If you're single, this is the friendship part. You can be intimate with someone without being sexually active, but it's that closeness that develops. You think about your besties or your best boys or your bros or your closest friends. That is where it really starts, because even before we become married, we should be developing and working towards that friendship. That's where that closeness is going to develop long before we even get to any kind of sexual relationship.
And I really believe that as believers, I believe that our intimacy begins with God, because it talks about a close familiar or friendship. That if we begin our intimacy with God, then what we're looking to do in a relationship is not to be fulfilled or made whole. It's that God is where we go for intimacy. And if that's our source of intimacy, everything else just becomes a place for us to give. I really believe that if we develop that intimacy with God through prayer, and we talk about real conversation and listening, we are reading the Bible and we're spending time in worship and we're doing all those things, then intimacy with our spouse, with ourselves and with our spouses becomes almost second nature. But I remember us having a pastor come and talk to us. This was years ago when we were in Louisiana. He came and talked to us about adultery. He talked about cheating. And he talked about how the biggest issue is that we have a God-sized space in our heart. And if we don't fill it with God, we're going to try to fill it with a person. And so if our sexual appetites are out of control, we need to really check what's our time with God like, what's our relationship with God like, because a person can't be the only source of our intimacy. So it's real conversation and listening, and it's being vulnerable with one another.
And that's so important, the real conversation and the listening part of it. These are things that you can actually use right now. If you are talking with your spouse or your significant other, your partner, and you say, you know what, maybe we need to work on intimacy a little bit. Here are 4 things that you can actually do right now that actually is a start of how do you actually build intimacy and how does it actually work? Well, it starts with the real conversation and listening, like Renee kind of talked about, because this is where you're going to be vulnerable. This is where you're going to open up and talk about your hopes, your dreams, your aspirations, your fears and things that have impacted
your secret fantasies,
that have impacted your life, because that's where you're going to draw in and become more familiar and more close with it. And this one, the forgive yourself. This can be challenging because when intimacy is lacking, we can have things that we are holding on to. And this is one that's a barrier that we held on to that impacted our life prior to the relationship that we may be in, that can kind of cause things to be obstacles and barriers. And we're going to show you some of those things here in a minute. But you have to believe that God has designed for us to be intimate with each other. And it starts with you forgiving yourself first. This is so important, because when you forgive yourself for things that have become obstacles and barriers,
or things that happened to you in your past, because we're talking about sex and intimacy. Yes. Sometimes people have things in their past, maybe you've been sexually abused, maybe you have some physical ailment. You have to forgive yourself and understand that there are things that happen to us that are beyond our control, but we have to realize that if we're saved and we're forgiven, then we have to forgive ourselves and we have to forgive others. That really allows intimacy to develop and cultivate.
And then finally, the give trust and grace to each other again. Yeah. This is where we have maybe some unforgiveness that may be hindering us. This is where the vulnerability, after you've been vulnerable and you've been having these open conversations and listening to each other, this is where you actually exercise the trust, and trust that the things that were told to you in confidence, that is where it's going to be built upon. Because if your spouse or your partner shares something with you about their life and their past, this is a test to trust you, because if they are opening up to you, this is them saying, I'm trying to build on the intimacy with you. And so we have to be mindful of that trust can't be violated. It can't be shared with your friends or outside of this covenant that you have with each other, because if that happens, it's going to build up a big, big barrier that sometimes can be very, very difficult to overcome.
And one of the things that I'll give an example of, what does it look like when you can't trust someone? If you have to start off a conversation by saying, don't tell anybody, then more than likely that person is someone you don't trust. I had to learn that the hard way. If I have to start off by saying don't tell anybody, I should know that when you and I are talking, that it's going to stay between you and I. Like anything that we talk about in this community, anything that you guys share, it's confidential. You guys don't have to tell, you don't have to ask me not to share it with anyone. We won't, because the way that you build trust is by knowing that when someone comes to you in confidence and they just come to you, that's not for you to share. It's for you to keep it. If Gil tells me something, that's between Gil and I. It's not for me to share with someone else, and vice versa.
And that's so important, because that is practiced not only in your partner spousal relationship, but in all your relationships, because you want to be that person that can be trusted and actually give grace. This is one of the reasons why we have all the screens blacked out, because we want this to be a time of you just being able to receive and listen and just take in the things that we're telling you. Because when we are sharing you with this information, this just comes from the things that we've seen and experienced, that we know we want to start you out on a solid footing and a solid foundation. What is intimacy? Now, intimacy can actually be cultivated on 3 areas. We talked about it at the very beginning, where you go through some kind of curriculum or course or whatever when it comes to marriage and counseling and all those types of things where sex may be talked about. These are some of the practical areas that we are talking about how you can develop it. These are 3 areas that you can focus on in developing the intimacy with each other. And Renee mentioned it already, as far as from a spiritual perspective. We put it in this order because we believe should be the most important role that it should be, because not that it's the only way it can be. This is something that is so focused because it plays a big impact on how your intimacy is actually developed. Praying and reading and worshiping together. This is when we're talking about it from a spiritual perspective.
And it really sets the tone, because you may not think that it matters to your sex life, but honestly, sex and intimacy is a form of worship. Mm-hmm. It's a form of you bowing down and letting go and being transparent. And when you do that with God. And so, the importance of being spiritually vulnerable and being spiritually intimate, it really opens you up to being physically intimate. And I love that it says non-sexual touch, because I think sometimes we don't understand that it's not, women are different. Women are all day long. It's I need to be touched throughout the day, and phone call, and and so that non-physical